Hi, everyone. Welcome to Happy to See Me. I'm Erika, and today I have something I was happy to see that I am so excited for. This is a big deal. I'm moving. If you're watching the video part of this podcast, this background is eventually going to be different in a few episodes. I'm staying in Toronto. I love Toronto. Toronto is my home right now, but I cannot wait to move. And for me, it's something that it really is going to be satisfying a personal dream and a personal want I've been having. I've always loved the idea of having a home that's set up for me. So it's decorated the way that I want. The space is set up exactly for who I am and for what I need in life and for how I want to enjoy life. And just for different reasons, I just never had that experience before. There's always been some reason to compromise. And I mean, sharing and compromising is cool, but it's just such an exciting time I'm about to enter into where I can define a new space just for me. So that's going to be keeping me busy for the next couple of weeks. And if you follow me on Instagram, I will be sure to document all of the furniture purchasing, the decorating. If you have suggestions, if you're into that, make sure you're following me on Instagram. But I cannot wait to level up. And speaking of leveling up, okay, I will share a second thing I was happy to see. I have been looking into studio space in Toronto. So yes, in my new place, I'm going to have a dedicated space for me to film and record this podcast. But I've been also looking at places in Toronto where I can actually bring guests in person and we can film our interviews in person. So who knows? Maybe in a few weeks, you'll see some of the podcasts that are from my home and then some of the podcasts that are from a studio space. But both me and Happy to See Me are leveling up. Let's go. There's so much exciting stuff to come when it comes to me in the podcast. Anyways, I am very excited for this episode. I am speaking to Madelyn Chung, who is the founder of the RepresentASIAN Project. So the RepresentASIAN Project is based here in Canada, and it's focused on celebrating and really providing a platform to elevate Asian representation in media. Madelyn talks about why she started this platform. Plus, she shares some, to be honest, messed up stories about what it was like growing up as the only Asian person in predominantly white communities. And if there are any Asian listeners, you will probably relate to some of the stories she tells. She also is very vulnerable talking about AAPI month and how, yes, it's amazing and it's busy and she got to be at so many places representing Asian people, but the toll that it took on her and the pressure behind the scenes was actually really tough because it's a lot of pressure to represent different Asian communities. So she's going to talk about all of that and give amazing recommendations for Asian pop culture we should be consuming this summer. So I hope you enjoy it. I loved having this conversation with her. So here it is, my interview with Madelyn Chung. Madelyn Chung, welcome to Happy to See Me. I'm so happy to have you here today.
And I'm happy to see you.
I like what you did there. So first, before we jump into it, you had a previous life as a journalist. I had a previous life as a PR person. I don't know if we've ever met, but I know that over the years, I've sent you lots of emails trying to pitch you on covering my clients. So one, cool that we crossed paths this way. And two, I'm sorry if it ever was too much.
And I'm sorry if I didn't respond because I am so bad at replying to emails. So yeah.
You know what? I think that with PR and also with journalism in its own way, with public relations and doing media relations especially, it very much gives you a thick skin. I'm like, okay, I'm going to fail 90% of these emails, but whatever. It's not the end of the world. So
wait, did that help you? Sorry, I'm like asking you the questions now because journalist in me. But did that help you in Survivor?
I think so. Yeah, because I think you realize, well, when I was working in public relations, a lot of what I was doing was pitching journalists and pitching them to cover my clients. But if I reach out to 100 people, if 3 of them cover the story, then that's a huge win. So a 3% success rate is considered the win, but then you kind of get used to the 97% of failing. So I realized, okay, I can fail and I still have my job and everything's fine. So it made it a bit easier going on the show, and then also dealing with everything that happens after the show, because I'm like, hey, I know what it's like for people to not have everybody not necessarily like me, but not necessarily respond to me the way I want, and it's fine.
Right. Yeah, I feel like I could never do a job in PR.
Yeah, people described it as like a sales job without the commission. So it was just the worst of all the worlds, but we're out of it now.
Oh my gosh, out of it. Moving on.
Now we are on to bigger and better things, which I would love to ask you about. I mean, I want to ask you about journalism too, but first, I want to start with the RepresentASIAN Project, because you have founded this amazing project. Can you tell everybody what it is?
So it's essentially the platform that I wished that I had when I was younger, because, you know, growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s, even going into like the 2010s, we didn't really have much Asian representation, and the representation that we had was just not good. It was very stereotypical. It was very tropey. And I think that really impacted my own relationship with my racial identity. So, you know, it really, to put it blankly, like made me resent being Asian. I also grew up with a bunch of white people around me, so I wasn't used to seeing people who looked like me, and that took a toll on me and my self-worth, and again, you know, coming to terms with my racial identity. So I really just wanted to create something that would help Asian Canadians, Asian North Americans, even Asians around the world, just be really proud of who they are, and to see themselves being celebrated, to see people celebrating them and their accomplishments, and also just kind of humanizing the Asian experience, you know, and recognizing that there are so many layers to us. We are not just, you know, smart, nerdy, blah, 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 all of the stereotypes that we've heard before. Like, there's a lot of, like, we're humans too. We have human experiences. So I just kind of wanted to not only elevate the community and celebrate them, but also just make them be comfortable with accepting who they are.
Yes. And I think that it's also something that I wish I saw when I was younger, because I had that similar experience. I was one of few Asian people in my hometown. It was a very much white community. And even being a Filipino person, I think I was one of, 3 or 4 in my elementary school, and that included my siblings. And any Asian representation that I saw, which was quite limited, it was always East Asian people. So I remember growing up for so long thinking, okay, are there other Filipino people on this planet? Like, where are they? I never see them on screen. How have you seen Asian representation change even in the last few years since you started the RepresentASIAN Project?
I mean, I think it's made huge strides. Obviously, we have a long way to go, but I think the catalyst for me really, I mean, there's a lot of things that led me to start it, but the thing that made me feel, or the first time I felt like truly, really proud to be Asian and felt comfortable celebrating it publicly, was 2018 when Crazy Rich Asians came out. Like, that was a huge thing for the community. It was like the first Asian-led film, Hollywood blockbuster in 25 years since the Joy Luck Club. And I just remember that was also the first time I had really written about my identity. So I was freelance writing. I wrote a piece for Flare.com, RIP, it's non-existent anymore. But I talked about how, you know, it's not just a movie to me. It's a sign that I also matter. And it was the first time, again, that I felt I was, you know, a bit better represented on screen. I think we can, you know, looking now and how far representation has come since then, we can say that, you know, it did also play into this trope of the Crazy Rich Asians. But just to see someone like Constance Wu on screen, like a Chinese woman as well, and like everyone's thinking, oh my God, look at how beautiful she is. Look at this, look at that. And I was like, I feel like I haven't had that when I was younger. So that was really the turning point for me. And I think from then, you know, we've really gone into more quote unquote positive representation, which is great. But I think a lot of it, you know, since Crazy Rich Asians was still like one-dimensional characters or still safe characters. But I think now what we're seeing is much more authentic representation. So if we think of Beef, did you see Beef on Netflix?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. So like that, we just see these multi-dimensional flawed characters who are showing rage. Like growing up in a Chinese household, it was like, you're not supposed to show your feelings. You're supposed to swallow your bitterness. You're supposed to save face. If I'm crying, it's like, stop crying. You're too sensitive. You can't be angry. You can't show rage. And then here are these people, just like the whole thing is about their rage and how they are expressing their rage. Maybe not in healthy ways, but it's just really cool to see. And, I was talking to a friend about this, and it's like, with other shows, we see white characters who are so flawed, yet we're still rooting for them, right? We think about Breaking Bad and things like that. There's, this guy making meth in a lab, but we're still kind of rooting for him in a way. So it's really cool to be able to see more authentic characters, more human characters. And I think that's really the direction that Asian representation is going, or should be going, is more so the authenticity to really broaden the scope of how we view Asians in the world.
I totally agree. And it's funny because even though I don't have Chinese heritage, I remember Crazy Rich Asians was also like this watershed moment for me where I thought, oh my gosh, the Asian people, one, they're almost every character on screen, and they're cool, and they're aspirational. They're who you want to be like. And I had never seen anything like that before. And I don't know, I feel like over the last few years, and perhaps you can relate to this, but now that I've entered my adulthood and we've seen more representation, it's almost like the first time in my life where I'm having so much fun being Asian. Like, I'm so into K-pop, so everyone knows that I love BTS. I've made so many friends through loving BTS, and I've been having so much fun supporting Filipino small businesses or going to the Asian grocery store and trying new foods. And when I was a kid, I hated going to the Asian grocery store. And
same. I was the exact same.
And I was like, at first I was like, oh, this is quote unquote not normal. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be eating these weird parts of the animal. But now I think it's so cool that there's so much of my culture to share and so much more to learn. Yeah. And also the flawed Asian representation, it goes across all different types of Asian heritages. Mm-hmm. Like, I've been watching the final season of Never Have I Ever, and why I love it is because Davy, the main character, is so flawed. She is so imperfect, and that's why I love her.
Yeah, and I think it's just like, I want to go back to just like this time of having fun being Asian. Even like, I'll never forget when Crazy Rich Asians came out. Simu Liu and Andrew Fung, this was before Simu was a Marvel star, they were on Kim's Convenience. He put a call out on Twitter being like, hey, everyone, let's go like buy all the tickets to this one showing at, the movie theater at Yonge and Dundas to watch Crazy Rich Asians. Let's just like celebrate and watch it together. And to be in this theater with, it's like we're in a room full of Asians. We are all laughing and crying and experiencing this together and seeing ourselves on screen together, but also like laughing together and being part of it together, not being like the butt of the joke or not being laughed at, truly just like understanding, like we get each other and we understand these moments we see on screen. That was so powerful. And like, again, I remember like leaving that movie, putting on my Facebook status because I was still using Facebook back then, but being like, I am so effing proud to be Asian right now. Like, I just feel so, so proud. But yeah, going into, the flawed characters and everything, I think if we think about also the model minority myth, right? And how we are supposed to be very put together, studious, all of these things. And a lot of the times too, like our parents, that's how they had to be, right? A lot of them who immigrated here, our grandparents, they had to keep their heads down and work hard in order to put a roof over our heads, put food on the table. But to be able to kind of really break through that in mass media will allow the rest of the community, like if we see that, it's like, okay, I'm allowed to be flawed. I do not have to be perfect. I am allowed to have feelings. I am going to feel angry. I'm going to feel sad. I'm going to feel sensitive. And all of that is okay. And I think that is the most powerful part of the authentic representation, is it allows us to truly be who we are.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's so amazing that you are carving out the space to highlight the people who are being like that, because yes, seeing somebody on screen being imperfect, it allows you to know that you don't have to be perfect as well. You can just be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I've read that something that's really important to you is changing the way that Asian women are viewed in media in North America. So can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think selfishly I want to change that because I am an Asian woman and I just want to make, the world a better place, not just for me, but for, the generations after me, for my peers, for my friends, for my family. And, I think we've really seen, again, because of mass media and stereotypes, we've seen Asian women be docile, meek, or hypersexualized. And I think I just think back to when I was growing up, how, these stereotypes were imposed on me, but I wasn't necessarily aware of it. But I'll give you an example of just like, I grew up in Whitby, Ontario. It's a very white town. And there was a country bar, and most of my friends were white. So they wanted to go to this country bar. And I'm like, I'm not a fan of country music, but whatever. I'm just going to assimilate and go. And I'll never forget, I walked into the bar and a bunch of guys, white guys, ran over to me and they're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, come here, come here. And they just pulled me to this other guy, another white guy, who was wearing a t-shirt that said, I heart Asians. And I was like, I just remember being like, can I swear? Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, do it.
I was like, what the fuck is this?
Mm-hmm.
And then they were like, oh my God, like, take a picture with him. You have to take a picture with him. And like, I was just like this prop, essentially, right? I was just like, I was not being treated like a human. I was just this prop of this thing that he loved, quote unquote, loved. And now he got to pose beside it wearing this photo, which he would probably post on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, get a bunch of likes and laughs. And I remember the friends I was with, who unfortunately I'm not friends with anymore, they were just like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is so cute. You should get his number, give him your number. Like, you guys could go out. What a cute love story this would be. And I was like, I don't have any interest in this guy. Like, but it was almost as if like, oh, here's someone who finally likes you, even though you're Asian. And I remember kind of trying to vocalize that, I was young. I was in my early 20s. And I remember trying to vocalize like, this is really fucked up. Like, this does not feel good. This feels weird. But they kind of brushed it off as, oh my God, you're like overreacting. You're being too sensitive, this or that. So here I am like posing for this fucking photo. And it just, I think back to that a lot. And I think about, how a lot of Asian women are treated as disposable or, just to be a notch in someone's belt or to be something that, like, oh, I got with an Asian girl. And I just like don't want that anymore. Like, I don't want Asian women to feel like that's all they are relegated to. Like, I want them to feel empowered. I want them to feel, to own their sexuality as opposed to being sexualized. I want them to be able to talk back to those people who are treating them this way and be like, listen, this is fucked up. Like, who do you think you are doing this? I'm a real person just like you. So I think I always think back to that example because it weighed so heavily on me. And I think back and I feel guilty of like, I wish I said something more, but I just was not in a place, I think, mentally or strength wise to do that. So it's really important to me now that, I have a bit more of a platform. I'm more comfortable in using my voice to really help advocate for Asian women and help redefine them to, encapsulate what wonderful beings we are and not just, dragon lady, sexualized, docile, meek, etc. I really want to allow or create a space that allows Asian women to be whoever they want to be.
Thank you for sharing that story. One, it's so fucked up. And two, I feel like so many Asian women and also Asian people growing up, I think have had similar experiences. Like, it's so weird. I think back, I spent almost the first 2 decades of my life just resigning to the fact and somehow accepting that I would always be the butt of some type of jokes. There would be some type of joke about, oh, I just came here from another country or I'm trying to get my green card or something. And in the moment, I didn't know any better. Again, because there was no representation, I didn't realize that there was more that I could want. So in the moment, I can't really blame my peers for saying stuff like that because we didn't know anything better. And to be honest, what's been amazing is since I started talking so much about my representation on Survivor and my experience as being an Asian woman, I have had friends from when I was a kid reach out to me and say, wow, I'm now rethinking so many of our experiences. So for me, there's not much more I could ask for. But I know that you also are a psychotherapist. So I'm curious, yes, we talk about the lack of representation or the lack of proper, diverse, real representation for Asian women on screen. So in your work as a psychotherapist, how does that translate into the experiences that Asian women have in their real life?
Whew, that's a good loaded question. I mean, the majority of my clients are Asian women, millennial or Gen Z women who, especially with the millennial women, because it's like same generation as me, it's really kind of working through those experiences of being treated less than, and not just by the outside world, but also just by our parents, right? There's so much there too when it comes to intergenerational trauma, along with racial trauma. And then with the younger ones, I think it's so interesting because the world is a little bit different for them, right? But than from like when I was growing up. But I think there's so many challenges too of now there's social media and now there's this and now there's that, and like bullying and all that stuff is much more prominent. But I think my mission to kind of help redefine or help women, Asian women, define themselves, it does definitely bleed into my therapy work, in that I want to give them the space to really explore their feelings and explore the traumas that they've gone through, and then from there come out stronger and really carve out a place for themselves in the world that feels good to them, as opposed to showing up in the world the way they think they're supposed to show up. Like I think a lot of Asian women, specifically East Asian women, we have like a lot of imposter syndrome. You hear a lot about, putting on some sort of mask or like a persona, because the world has kind of taught us we need to be a certain way and we need to show up a certain way, and that's how we show up. At least that's been my experience. It's like I've always been like, I need to be perfectly put together. I cannot show weakness. I cannot do this or that. Even till now, like it's really hard for me to kind of, I actively try to show my human side, to take the pressure off myself and also like kind of lead by example. So, I've always wanted to be perfect and I've always wanted to be put together and seen a certain way. But I'm kind of recognizing the power of vulnerability and the freedom that comes with being imperfect and showing that imperfection, and showing up being like, hey, I'm maybe not my best self today, but I'm here, I'm still showing up, and that's okay. I'm just going to do the best I can and not judge myself for maybe not saying things the way I would have wanted to say it, or like answering questions the way I would have wanted to answer. We got on this call earlier and I was like, you asked me how I was doing. And I was like, hey, my anxiety is really high today. And old me, like 5-10 years ago, would have never said that. I would have been like, everything's great. I'm awesome. Let's do this. But to be able to kind of say that and be like, admit and just show my human side, I think is so important. So that's kind of what I like to encourage in my clients, especially the ones who are Asian women.
It's good that you're doing that because that is truly what sets us all free, right? But leading by example, It shows that, hey, I can show up and be like, I don't know, I showed up and my headphones were tangled. I'm like, sorry, I can't hear you, but it's fine.
It's fine. And that's just life, and I've come to accept that, yeah, my life is pretty chaotic and I burn out a lot and I need to probably take better care of myself, but I'm not here to kind of judge myself for that anymore. Before I would have been like, why am I not able to do this? Why? And I think it goes back to also like when you see people who you perceive as super successful or who have it all or have it all together, when those people are open about like, hey, I don't have my shit together, I'm actually a hot mess like 90% of the time, it's like, oh, okay, I don't feel as bad for being a mess too, right? It's like, yeah, there's a lot of I think from the outside, people could look at me and be like, wow, she has a lot of success. She got to do this, 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 this. But it's like behind the scenes, I've just been crying all the time and I've been burnt out and I sleep a lot. And, and I think that's a really important side to share too, to show that, yes, people struggle. Everyone has struggles. And I think if you're comfortable with sharing that, do that, because it just, again, shows that human side. It helps us break free of this model minority myth. It helps us break free of these stereotypes and these tropes. So all that's to say is just show your human self.
Thank you for saying that. And I know that last month was just AAPI month, so it was such a busy month for you. And I kept seeing on social media, you were here speaking, you were at this event, you were launching this initiative, you were doing all this stuff. And then you posted your summary of the month of everything you did. And then you also mentioned, okay, I also had all these mental breakdowns. I was freaking out. And that really resonated with me because, one, it looks like you are this amazing role model for the Asian community, which I think that you are. On the flip side, you are also struggling when this should be your month when you are shining and successful and everything should be good on paper. So what happened last month?
I mean, what happened? A lot of shit happened. I think it goes down to, and I talked about this recently on a panel, and I talk about it a lot, of just these months, these heritage months, or these months that are dedicated to marginalized folks. They're great in that it's like a time for us to celebrate, be celebrated, really take up space. But it also comes with a lot of pressure, and it comes with it takes a toll on you emotionally, because here you are being asked by other people, maybe not from the Asian community, to show up, to represent, to, help brands hit their diversity quotas. And it's just like, sometimes it feels like tokenism, or sometimes it feels like you're being used. And to have to show up so fully and to share your lived experience, which I love doing, don't get me wrong. Like, I think it's such a privilege to be able to do that, but to compress it all into 1 month of just like, okay, we really care about you this month, but the other 11 months of the year, we don't really give a shit. That's tough. So it's like added pressure where it's like, okay, this is my one chance this year to show up, and I better do a good job, because if I don't do a good job, then they're not going to ask me again, or maybe they won't ask other people. So it's like I almost feel like it's dependent on me to do a good job to prove myself and my community to other people, when really it shouldn't be like that. It should be like, yeah, you should be asking us to like come and talk and take up space. We should be able to take up this space, but like, we should also be able to take up this space 365 days a year, and that goes for all marginalized folks, with Black History Month, Pride Month, et cetera, et cetera. And so many other women came up to me, and like a lot of Muslim women were like, oh yeah, like I'm a content creator. Brands only come to me when it's like Ramadan or Eid, right? And it just gets so exhausting to just pack it all into 1 month. So what happened was, I did the things, and I'm trying to get better at saying no to things. But it's hard, especially when, some of them are just such great opportunities. So I cried a lot. Cried almost like every night for the month of May. I was a mess, and then I would just pull myself together to show up for whatever I had to do, and then go back home and cry again. And just like, that was May for me, and I'm still recovering from it. It's still hard for me to fully show up. I have to be very selective of where I'm showing up, because I don't have much left to give right now. I don't feel like I have much to give.
Thank you for doing all of that labor during AAPI month. And thank you for being here, knowing that you have to be selective. Thank you for having this conversation with me today. I'm sorry you had so many mental breakdowns. It must be a lot of pressure, because you are just one person who wanted to talk about their lived experience, and then being someone with ambition and who works hard and works with good intention, it all of a sudden becomes, okay, now you have this platform where you're trying to lift up all Asian communities. Is it a lot of pressure to have to represent all of the different types of Asian communities, even if you're not necessarily a part of them.
100%. And it's tough. Like, I know I'm not doing the best at it, right? Like, I can say Represent Asian Project skews heavily East Asian. And I think that's because, I am East Asian. A lot of the stuff that I resonate is what I post. Like, I resonate with is what I post. But there's not a lot of stuff about South Asians or Southeast Asians. I mean, my partner is Filipino, so I put a lot of Filipino stuff. I will say that I feel connected to that community because of my partner. Yeah, but I think it's really tough because Asia is like the biggest continent and there's so many countries in Asia, right? And it goes to this question too of like, who actually considers themselves Asian, right? Like, of those people who are from the continent of Asia and those countries, who considers themselves Asian? So it's really tough when, I understand when people send messages and say like, what about this? Or what about that? Or why don't you cover this? And I try to make it a point to be like, hey, you know what? I'm really sorry. We'll work on it. And, to take that advice, but it's also a lot to do as a very small team who is essentially doing this as like a passion project or a side project. Like, we all have other jobs. I work like 4 or 5 jobs, right? And this is just like one of them. So it sometimes gets really tough when people are like, do better, And it's like, fuck, man, I'm trying. I'm really trying. And like, I get it. And I get, it is called the Represent Asian Project. And I get that everyone wants to be seen and everyone wants to be heard and everyone wants to be represented. But I think there's only so much that a few people can do. If I had all the money and resources in the world, then yeah, of course, we would like expand it bigger and do a better job of that. But with the limited resources and bandwidth, we're doing the best we can. But it is hard. It is really hard to try to represent a whole continent of people with, like, a lot of us have, I guess, similar and shared experiences, but there's also so many vast differences, right, between different communities within the Asian diaspora. So it's definitely a challenge.
But I think you're doing an amazing job with where you are because it only started a few years ago. And something like this, it has to start with one person and then it slowly scales where you get partners and more contributors and then you have more people and you're able to talk about more stories and cover different parts of Asian culture. So I think you're very much at almost still the beginning phase, even though I know it's a few years old and it's only going to flourish further. And I appreciate that you're open about talking about this and you're willing to give yourself grace because I hope that if there's somebody out there who is just starting something, I feel like I'm in the same boat, that they are able to give themselves the same grace and the same compassion for other people too.
And I think we need to give compassion and grace to each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, as you know, the internet can be so quick to quote unquote cancel people, and some of that is warranted, but other times it's like, yes, we do need to give people grace and remind each other that we are humans, we are going to make mistakes, and it's unfortunate that some people make mistakes and it's seen by more people or it's on a bigger platform. And it's something that I'm always scared of like, oh shoot, what if I really like mess something up and make a big mistake? But I think for me, what I've tried to do is, if I have made a mistake and people kind of call me out on it or call me in on it, I like to be candid about that. I like to be open about it and to say like, hey, we put up this post and maybe it wasn't the right thing to put up, and this is why. And thank you to the people who pointed that out to us with grace and compassion to let us know that like, maybe that wasn't the vibe. Like maybe that was not a good idea to do that. And I appreciate people who do that again with grace and compassion because we're not going to be perfect, right? We need to learn from each other. And I think there's so much, again, power in letting people know and being critical with grace and compassion, because how else are we going to learn? How else are we going to grow as human beings? How else are we going to expand our views of the world and overcome our biases and privileges and viewpoints? So that's important.
Everyone makes mistakes, and I think we should give each other room to make mistakes, provided that people are willing to have that self-reflection and that growth mindset. If you're going to make a mistake and you're just going to be like, no, this is how it is, then you're in a different category. But yes, we are allowed to grow.
Yes.
I do want to ask you a bit about your journey because you have done so many professions over the last couple years, starting with when you were a journalist. So even though when you were a journalist, you had this career where you were telling stories, you were publishing articles at some of the biggest media outlets in Canada, did that feel like it was enough for you? Like, what prompted you to go off and start your own platform?
So I wanted to be a fashion journalist since I was 15 or 16. I like grew up watching fashion television with my mom, and I was like, I want to be the next Jeannie Becker. I want to work at like all the big magazines. And that was a dream that I kind of just ran with and did. And, you know, I was lucky enough to kind of achieve that goal. And I loved what I did, but I think it got to a point where I was feeling very unfulfilled because I was like, how is this kind of contributing to the greater good to continue writing about the Kardashians and what they're wearing? So, you know, and then in 2016, I believe it was, I got laid off from my job, and that job was my whole identity. You know, like I was like, Madelyn Chung is the style editor of HuffPost Canada, and if I don't have that, then I'm nothing. You know, I placed so much value and so much of my self-worth on that job title. And even everything I did outside of work was work related. Like stuff I did after work was always like events or hanging out with like people in the industry. So it was a rude awakening almost to kind of have that ripped away from me. And it really forced me to look at myself. And I was lucky that I got another job shortly after at Fashion Magazine. But what I found was that the more I was doing that work, I was like, I am so unfulfilled. Like there has to be more to life than this. And, you know, that's when I kind of decided to completely switch careers. And that's kind of when I decided to go the therapy route. So I quit my job and dedicated myself to focus on going back to school and doing my master's. And while that was happening, that was around the time that Crazy Rich Asians came out, and I was freelance writing, and I found that, you know, I wanted to write more about identity. And a lot of times when I pitched publications about stuff about identity, or even just like beauty tips for Asian girls, like how do you keep the curl in your lashes, or like how do you stay blonde without it turning orange? A lot of people were just like, it's too niche. And I was like, what do you mean it's too niche? There's a whole, like, I think 20% of Canadians are Asian, right? Like, it's not too niche. It's a huge chunk of the population. And so that's when, you know, I was kind of like, I am tired of writing for white people. I'm tired of trying to explain myself. I'm tired of trying to prove that my culture and my identity is worth writing about. You know, I'm tired of being almost like I felt like I was like someone was gatekeeping me. So I was like, okay, then I'm going to do my own thing and be able to tell stories my own way. And the whole idea is that anyone who writes for Represent Asian Project doesn't have to explain themselves. You know, I really want the stories that there's so many stories that people were like, I tried to pitch this here or there, and people were like, no, this won't work. This won't work. I'm like, give me that story. This is the place to put it. Tell your story the way you want it to be told, because a lot of writers and journalists spend so much time, especially lifestyle ones who are people of color, spend their time writing it in the way that, you know, the corporation, the business wants it to be told. The capitalistic white supremacist society wants it to be told. So I really want to be able to tell our stories in our way, in the way that we want to share them with the world.
Yes. Going back to what we were saying earlier in the conversation, for anybody who is a writer and they want to tell a story about an Asian person or Asian culture, at the Represent Asian Project, you do not need to wait for it to be May for you to get the approval to have this article published. There is a place for you 365 days of the year. And I hope and I have faith that it's only going to get bigger. I think that many Asian people and anybody who really is in an underrepresented community, I think that we've all had that experience, whether it's a corporate job or some type of job where you're in it, you're in your early 20s, you're grinding, you're picking up the skills, you're making money, but it just doesn't feel fulfilling. And then when you do get recognition, sometimes they need you to show up in the company website photo shoot because they need to check off a box.
Yes, exactly.
And it's amazing that you were able to walk away from that and you were able to move towards something that you are now more passionate about. And again, something that contributes to the world, because I feel like we need more of that. So another thing that I've seen you talk about before is how the Asian Canadian experience always gets lumped in with the Asian American experience, but they're actually very different. So in your view, what is the difference?
That's a good question. I don't even know if I can like pinpoint the differences, but I think, if we think back to history of Asians in Canada, that's kind of a very different history. I recently went to Vancouver for the first time, and I visited Vancouver's Chinatown, and there was an amazing museum called the Chinatown Storytelling Center. And it really just gave the history of Chinese people in Canada and a lot of stuff that I didn't know before. Like, we don't learn that stuff in history books, right? Like, we learned a little bit about the railway workers and this and that, but like all of the injustices, and again, hearing it from the perspective of those people, of Chinese people, as opposed to whoever the white authors or historians were who wrote our textbooks in high school. I think, I don't know, it's a really tough question to answer. I think the other thing is just that, Canada touts itself as, I think we always like to think that we are better than the States in that we are more diverse, we are more inclusive, we are this and that, but like, we're not that far off from shit going awry. Like, there's still a lot of racism here. There's still a lot of prejudice here. When the, anti-Asian hate attacks during the pandemic were really, really prominent, or people were paying more attention to them, the attacks in Canada, like, there was actually more attacks in Canada per capita than in the States. Yet no one was talking about it here. Everyone was just talking about the States, right? So I don't know if it's a matter of like, we tend to look to the States, or we tend to just be like, oh, it's like their problem, it's their problem, and we don't recognize all the work that we need to do here. So I think that's kind of one of the big differences. And I think it's important, all that to say is, I kind of want to center a lot more on the Asian Canadian experiences in Represent Asian Project, just because a lot of the history we didn't learn, right? Like, it's going back to how we didn't learn this stuff. And it's important for us to know our history, to know the history of other marginalized communities in this country, to foster that sense of understanding and solidarity between these communities, because, the one thing that we do have in common is that we've been marginalized. We've been pushed down to feel like we are not important, we are not good enough, we are not as worthy as a white person. So that's like a really important thing for me, is to just really learn more about that history and to share that knowledge with our audience.
Yes. It's almost like a double whammy, because we grow up thinking we're not as worthy as white people. But then also as Canadians, I think there's a bit of a complex where we feel like, I don't know, the US is so flashy and gets all the attention, and we're kind of next door. And then being an Asian in Canada, it's like, oh, wow, we have a lot of work to do if we want to make any big progress here. So before we wrap up, I want to ask, what is some Asian pop culture you think we should all be consuming right now?
Ooh, that's such a good question. We talked about Never Have I Ever. Love that show. I think that's such a great show for, again, showing flawed characters. I've heard that Past Lives is an incredible movie. I have yet to see it. But what I've heard is that you really need to bring the tissues when you watch it. A great movie that I saw recently from a Asian Canadian filmmaker is called Rice Boy Sleeps. And that is just such a beautiful film about, being a second generation, or being the child of an immigrant in Canada. And this family in particular, they are Korean. But just seeing the scenes of like, this boy had a Korean name and his teacher kind of forced him to change it because no one could pronounce it, or the stinky lunches, or all of this stuff. It really encapsulated that experience so beautifully. I was sobbing. I went to a screening with the director there, and it was like so embarrassing, because when I saw the director after, he was like, Oh yeah, I saw and heard you crying.
Oh, you must have been
really
weeping.
affected you. It was like convulsions. It's a very, very good film. And I'm really excited for Joyride. Just because it's like, I feel like that's the movie that Asian women have been wanting and needing.
Mhm.
Like, it's like our version of like Girls Trip or Bridesmaids or The Hangover. And to have like a raunchy film of Asian women owning their sexuality and being so, almost crass, which again, we
Mhm.
don't really see, and it's on their terms, I think is really cool and refreshing. So I'm very excited for that. Two more recommendations. Or three, book wise, I'm reading Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Really, really good book. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I saw it at the Indigo the other day. So I was like, okay, I have to add this to my list this summer.
It's a really great read. It's a fiction book, but it's a really, really great read. And two nonfictions. One that I recommend to a lot of people is called What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. She's a former journalist, and it's a memoir about her complex PTSD. And I think it's just so cool to read a book about mental illness from the perspective of an Asian woman because, well, again, a lot of the stuff that we read is from white people. And Superfan by Jen Sukfong Lee. She's Canadian. And it talks about how pop culture shaped her as an Asian woman or an Asian girl growing up in Canada. So it's really, really interesting.
Oh, that is so up my alley. I know what I'm reading and I'm consuming this summer. Madelyn, if people want to follow you or the Represent Asian Project, where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram or TikTok. Same with Represent Asian Project. And if I can quickly plug to Represent Asian Project's new nonprofit arm, it's called the Blossom Mental Health Fund. It's a registered nonprofit just dedicated to supporting the mental health of Asian Canadians. So you can find that at the Blossom Fund or theblossomfund.org.
That is an amazing organization. I think it's so important because in Asian communities, taking care of your mental health, it's just not something that our parents grew up really understanding. However, it's so important. So I'm so happy that you're raising awareness for that. So check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I know you've been so busy. Thank you. And I hope you get some well-deserved rest.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for holding this space for me. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Madelyn Chung. If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, especially ratings and reviews. That helps people to find the podcast. And here's my promise to you. If you write a review and it's like cool and appropriate and just nice, then I'll read it on the show in the future. So please write a review. And if you haven't already, please follow the podcast on Instagram or on YouTube. It is at Happy to See Me Pod. Thank you so much for spending time with me this week, and I will see you next week.